September 4th, 1944. The humid air over the Philippine Sea shimmered with the heat of late afternoon. Below, a thin trail of black smoke twisted upward from the ocean, marking the death of another aerial duel. Lieutenant Jiro Tanaka of the Imperial Japanese Navy squinted against the glare of the sun, scanning the sky for survivors, or spoils. Moments earlier, his formation of Mitsubishi A6M50s had clashed with a group of new American fighters, unlike any they had encountered before. The Americans called them Hellcats, and one of those machines, riddled with gunfire but still miraculously intact, now drifted toward a coral islet, its pilot ejecting just before impact. Tanaka's Zero banked hard left, circling the downed plane as it skidded into the sand with a crunch of metal and a scream of torn propeller blades. The Hellcat, blue-gray, broad-winged, and brutally solid, had crashed but not burned. That alone was a mystery. A Zero hit that many times would have been a fireball by now. Incredible, Tanaka muttered, as his wingman's voice crackled over the radio. Should we destroy it? But Tanaka hesitated. Something in him, part curiosity, part instinct, wanted to see what the Americans were flying. Within hours, a small recovery team arrived by boat, hauling ropes, fuel, and a portable engine hoist. Under cover of night, they worked silently, knowing Allied patrols prowled nearby. When dawn broke, the impossible had been achieved. An intact Grumman F6F Hellcat lay hidden beneath palm fronds awaiting transport. It would be shipped piece by piece back to Japan for study. The journey took weeks. The wreck was dismantled, packed into crates labeled aviation equipment, and sent first to Manila, then by freighter to Yokosuka Naval Air Arsenal. Japanese engineers, already exhausted from months of constant bombing, were astonished at what they unpacked. The plane's construction was alien to them. Thick aluminum ribs, reinforced wings, self-sealing fuel tanks, and bulletproof glass nearly twice the thickness of the Zero's canopy. It was the embodiment of industrial brute force. By late October, the Hellcat had been painstakingly reassembled and made flight-ready. Naval officers from the Yokosuka Air Group gathered around the aircraft like priests around an idol. The rising sun shimmered on its dark paint, and the Japanese mechanics moved with quiet reverence. This was not merely a captured machine, it was a window into the enemy's advantage. Lieutenant Commander Katsuhiko Kawanishi, one of Japan's most skilled test pilots, was chosen to fly it. As he climbed into the cockpit for the first time, he was struck by the weight of the controls, the unfamiliar layout, the sense of overwhelming solidity. He turned the ignition switch. The massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine roared to life with a deep growling thunder, unlike the light purr of the Zero's Nakajima Sakai engine. The ground trembled beneath it. The engineers exchanged uneasy glances. When the Hellcat lifted off the runway, it did so with the grace of a predator. The sound echoed through the valley as the test crew watched it climb, the sunlight flashing off its broad wings. At first, the Japanese officers smiled, impressed but confident. They believed the Hellcat was simply an overbuilt American machine, powerful, yes, but clumsy and heavy compared to their agile Zeros. But as Kawanishi banked and rolled the plane, testing its controls, his expression began to change. The handling was not sluggish. It was smooth, steady, responsive, like a sword balanced perfectly in the hand. At 15,000 feet, he throttled up, feeling the raw power surge through the frame. The Hellcat climbed higher, faster than any Zero could dream of. The altimeter needle spun, the air thinned, and the plane barely shuddered. Below, engineers scribbled notes, unaware that their pilot's confidence had turned to something darker. When Kawanishi leveled off, the radio crackled with static. "It feels indestructible," he said quietly. "The wings so strong. And the armor, it is like steel." On the ground, an uneasy silence settled over the men listening. For months, they had wondered how the Americans were outlasting them in the skies of the Pacific. Now, for the first time, they were beginning to understand. When Kawanishi landed, his face was pale, his flight suit soaked with sweat. He stepped down from the cockpit and looked at the engineers gathered before him. "This plane," he said softly, "is built for war we can no longer fight." He paused, glancing back at the aircraft, its blue-gray skin still gleaming in the morning light. "We cannot outturn it." We cannot outrun it. It can take what we cannot. His words struck like a confession, and though few among them would say it aloud, the truth had begun to dawn. The age of the Zero, the pride of Japan, was over. November 1st, 1944. Over the coastal airfield at Yokosuka, a pale dawn light crept over the hangars as Lieutenant Commander Kawanishi prepared for another test flight. The Hellcat had been refueled, its engine checked, its systems tuned. Today the plan was simple but bold. Pit it directly against Japan's best. Two veteran Zero pilots, Lieutenant Jiro Tanaka among them, would take off and engage the captured American fighter in mock combat. It was meant to be a data-gathering exercise, a scientific duel in the sky. But for the pilots, it felt like something more personal, like facing the ghost of a future they didn't want to believe in. As the engines roared to life, the morning mist scattered in waves. The Zeros lifted gracefully like silver birds, while the Hellcat rolled down the runway in a growl of power and torque. To those watching from the ground, it seemed almost unfair, a dance between speed and strength, agility and endurance. At 3,000 feet, the mock battle began. The Zeros split apart, climbing fast, circling the Hellcat in tight turns like predators around a whale. Kawanishi throttled up, pulling into a steep climb. The Zeros followed, but instantly began to lag. The Hellcat's engine, almost twice the power of theirs, hauled it upward like a rocket. Over the radio, Tanaka's strained voice crackled. "He's climbing too fast!" "Impossible!" Then, at the top of the arc, Kawanishi rolled, inverted, dove, and came back down in a controlled spiral. His guns lined perfectly with where Tanaka's Zero would have been had this been war. "Brake! Brake!" Tanaka shouted, pulling hard to the right, his wings shuddering under the stress. But even in the dive, the Hellcat stayed stable, its heavy frame slicing through the air with an authority the Japanese pilots had never felt from an American plane. Back on the ground, the flight engineers stared through binoculars. "He's turning tighter than expected," one said. "That shouldn't be possible with that weight." Another noted the Hellcat's energy retention. It didn't lose speed as sharply in turns, didn't bleed power when climbing. It could fight on its own terms and dictate when the engagement began or ended. For half an hour they dueled. The Zeros darted, spun, and twisted in desperate elegance. But every time they thought they'd found an opening, the Hellcat's thick skin and power advantage erased their edge. Once Tanaka managed to slip behind Kawanishi, mimicking a dogfight from the Solomons. He pressed the trigger, click, click, imaginary bullets. "I've got him!" he shouted. But then the Hellcat banked hard, rolling over and pulling away effortlessly. "No," Kawanishi said over the radio, calm and grave. "You would have missed." The test ended with all three planes circling back to the field. When they landed, silence filled the hangar except for the ticking of cooling engines. The mechanics and officers crowded around, waiting for the verdict. Kawanishi climbed out slowly, helmet under his arm, his expression unreadable. He walked past the Hellcat's broad wings, brushing his fingers across the thick rivets. "It feels nothing like our Zero," he said finally. "It is not made to dance. It is made to endure." Tanaka stepped forward, his face drawn tight. "But surely we can outmaneuver it," he said, almost pleading. "If we're faster, if we surprise them." Kawanishi shook his head. "No, they do not fight like we do. They fight to survive. This machine allows them to survive anything." He turned to the gathered officers. "If this is what every American pilot flies now, then our strategy, our courage, our skill, none of it will matter. We cannot meet this in open battle and win." For a moment, no one spoke. Outside, the sea wind carried the faint hum of distant engines, Allied bombers training somewhere beyond the horizon. The war was closing in, and they all felt it. That evening, Kawanishi wrote a report to the Naval Ministry. His handwriting was neat but heavy with resignation. The Grumman Hellcat is superior to the Zero in speed, climb, durability, and firepower. Its design sacrifices agility for survival, but that sacrifice is justified by its overwhelming endurance. Against such a plane, even the bravest pilot will find his skill meaningless. When the report reached Tokyo, senior officers read it in silence. Some dismissed it as exaggerated. Others understood too well what it meant. By the end of 1944, Japan's factories could no longer produce enough fuel, pilots, or planes to match America's relentless industry. And now even their legendary Zero, once the terror of the Pacific, was obsolete. Weeks later, Kawanishi stood on the same airstrip, watching a new generation of young recruits prepare for their first and often last missions. The Hellcat sat silent in the corner of the hangar, its American markings still faintly visible beneath the fresh coat of paint. He looked at it one last time, then turned away. "The sky belongs to them now," he whispered. The Hellcat's engine wound down with a reluctant growl, its propeller blades slowing until they glinted like a broken fan under the Okinawan sun. Lieutenant Commander Toshiro slid open the canopy, his gloved hand trembling slightly as he reached for the latch. He was drenched in sweat, his flight suit clinging to him. The air outside was thick, salty, and smelled faintly of oil and burnt rubber. On the tarmac below, a cluster of Japanese engineers and officers waited, their faces tight with expectation. They had all watched in silence as he put the captured American fighter through its paces. Now they wanted answers. Toshiro climbed down slowly, his boots hitting the ground with a hollow thud. For a long moment he didn't speak. He simply stared at the F6F Hellcat as if it were a living thing, some kind of iron beast that defied everything he had once believed about aerial warfare. The aircraft loomed over the men, its wings wide and heavy, its armor plates dull from combat. Compared to the slender grace of a Zero, it looked brutish. But Toshiro now knew that this brute had teeth, and it bit hard. Captain Nakamura, the test director, stepped forward. "Well?" he asked. His voice was low but edged with tension. "How does it fly?" Toshiro took a breath, then exhaled slowly. "It flies like a hammer," he said finally. "But a hammer that cannot be stopped." He glanced at the gathered men, his gaze sharp. "It's heavier than the Zero, yes. Slower to climb, less elegant. But it doesn't matter. Because when it turns with authority. And when it fires, the sky breaks open." He gestured toward the Hellcat's wings. 650 caliber guns, each capable of tearing apart a Zero in a second. The engine power, the climb rate, the sheer strength of this frame. He paused, searching for words. "We can't match it anymore. The war in the air has changed." The engineers murmured among themselves, jotting notes, sketching diagrams, their excitement mingling with dread. They had known America's new fighters were formidable, but hearing it from one of their own, a pilot who had fought since the early days over the Coral Sea, made it undeniable. Later that evening, as the orange sun dipped behind the Okinawan hills, Toshiro sat alone near the edge of the airfield. The Hellcat rested behind him, its shadow long and dark across the concrete. He stared toward the horizon, where the Pacific shimmered faintly, a vast mirror reflecting a dying empire. He remembered the early days of the war, the pride, the invincibility. The way Zero pilots had danced through enemy formations, uncatchable, unstoppable. But those days were gone. He had seen the future in that cockpit. The thick armor, the relentless power, the stability even under punishment. The Americans had learned. They had built machines not for grace, but for survival. Machines that could take hits, deliver death, and return home. Machines that didn't need to be the fastest, only the last ones flying. The truth settled over him like the humid night. Japan's aerial edge was finished. The Zero, once a symbol of dominance, was now an artifact of an earlier war. The Hellcat, the Corsair, the Mustang, these were weapons forged in the crucible of industrial might and practical design. He stood and turned to the Hellcat one last time. Its fuselage gleamed faintly under the floodlights, a reminder of a new age of air power. Toshiro gave a small nod, part respect, part resignation. "You were the end of us," he whispered, "and the beginning of something greater." As he walked away, the cicadas began their nightly chorus, filling the humid air with their rhythmic cries. In the distance, engines hummed, American bombers passing far overhead, invisible in the twilight. The sky once ruled by the Zero now belonged to them. By the time dawn broke over Okinawa, the Hellcat was already being dismantled by Japanese technicians, its secrets meticulously recorded, its design studied in silence. But deep down, everyone who had seen it fly that day knew. It wasn't just a machine they had captured. It was a message. The war in the Pacific had turned, and Japan's legendary flyers, who had once laughed at the stubby, heavy American fighters, now understood the truth. The laughter was over.